At our family BBQ, my sister smirked, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Time to move out." The others laughed. Some even raised their cups like it was a toast. No one knew I already owned the house. But the insult wasn't in her words. It was in their comfort. They didn't flinch. They didn't blink. They were used to that script by now. The roles had been rehearsed too well. I was the leftover, the squatter, the ghost in the family portrait. And yet, no one noticed the legal folder tucked in my tote, the quiet document that would rewrite everything before dessert was served. My name is Brittany Ferlin. I'm 32, live in San Diego, and work as a freelance strategist for branding firms, mostly startups, too. New to know who they are or legacies too cracked to admit they've fallen behind. My job has never been about fame, and that's suited me fine. I work behind the curtains, build campaigns that go viral under other people's names, write scripts for CEO speeches I'll never attend. But in my family, where showmanship passes for substance, silence isn't seen as humility, it's mistaken for weakness. And that night, as I stood near the cooler, trying to steady my breath, it was clear nothing had changed now. The house belonged to my father once, a single-story Spanish colonial he'd saved decades to buy. He laid the tiles in the hallway himself, mixed concrete for the backyard steps, planted a lemon tree near the fence that still leaned slightly from a teenage storm. Growing up, it was the place where Sunday smelled like rosemary and the sound of the game drifted in from the living room. But after Dad got sick, after I moved back to take care of him, it became something else entirely. A burden, a boundary, a battleground no one saw but me. My sister Samantha wasn't around for that. She visited once every couple months, maybe a weekend here and there if her calendar allowed. She posted smiling selfies from the hospital room, hashtagging hope and family, while I wiped vomit off the bathroom tiles. And when Dad passed, she arrived 3 days late, didn't attend the legal reading, and still somehow walked out holding his old watch and half the living room furniture. Mom said not to make a fuss, said grief looked different on everyone, said I should focus on what really mattered. So I did. I focused on the plumbing that kept failing, the HOA letters that piled up, the contractor no one else called. I focused on saving the house. And somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to save the family. That barbecue wasn't about celebrating anything. It was a tradition, soaked in habit, held every summer, as if we were all still 9 and innocent. But that night, everything felt staged. The music was too loud, the smiles too rehearsed. Samantha played hostess, floated from guest to guest with her wine glass raised like a wand. And when I arrived, barely 5 minutes in, she launched the first strike with a voice syrupy enough to make strangers think it was kindness. "Oh, wow, Brittany made it," she said, eyes sparkling with that false sweetness. "So, any updates on finding your own place yet? Or are we still camping out in Dad's shrine?" I smiled, like I hadn't heard her, picked up a cup, and poured water, like it was the only thing that mattered. But the heat crawled up my back, and I could feel the eyes on me. Their silence wasn't neutral. It was agreement wrapped in politeness. I nodded, once, then walked toward the folding table. That's when I saw it. A name tag. Each one had been labeled by hand in bright blue ink. Mine said, Brittany, live-in daughter. I held it a second too long. Enough for someone to snicker. Enough to know it wasn't random. I peeled it off without a word, folded it once, then again, then slipped it into my back pocket like a piece of evidence. Not out of shame, but because someday, someone might need to remember that before I reclaimed my place. I was erased in plain sight. Later that night, as they posed for pictures and clinked plastic wine glasses under the patio lights, I looked around and realized something had shifted, not in them, in me. I wasn't waiting to be acknowledged anymore. I wasn't standing by, hoping someone would notice the missing photos or the misnamed name tags. I had brought proof. I had brought the deed. And tonight, I wasn't here for reconciliation. I was here for truth. There was a time when I thought being quiet was the same as being respectful, that if I didn't make waves, if I smiled at the right moments and excused the wrong ones. Eventually, I'd earn a seat at the table that felt like it had always belonged to someone else. Growing up, Samantha was the one they photographed. Every recital, every birthday cake, every honor roll pin found its way into a frame or onto the fridge. Meanwhile, I became good at lighting candles without being noticed, at refilling cups and folding napkins while conversations flowed around me like I wasn't there. I never resented it back then. I just thought maybe that was love, quiet and invisible, the kind that stayed behind to sweep up when the party was over. But grief has a way of stripping the paint off memory. And when Dad got sick, the truth started showing through the cracks. So he was the one who saw me, even when he didn't say it out loud. When I moved back home, it wasn't out of obligation. I just couldn't imagine him facing that kind of decay alone. I left a job I loved, a city I had finally made peace with, and returned to the house I had tried to grow beyond. At first, I told myself it was temporary, but the days blurred, the treatments got longer, the bills piled up, and the ceiling leaked, and no one else showed up. Samantha sent flowers twice, once with the wrong name on the card. She made a post when Dad went into hospice, a grainy throwback with a caption about strength and family legacy. She didn't call. I remember one night, 2 weeks before he passed, Dad woke up confused and tried to walk out the front door. I found him standing barefoot on the porch, staring at the mailbox like it had betrayed him. His hands were shaking, and when I guided him back inside, he looked at me and whispered, "I didn't think it would be you." I wasn't sure what he meant until later. After the funeral, after the reading, after the lawyer handed me the envelope with my name in his handwriting and told me not to open it unless I was ready to carry the weight of what was inside. I waited over a year. By then, the house had become a shell of its former self, worn but still standing. I thought maybe that was enough. I thought maybe if I kept it going, eventually they'd see it too. But Samantha didn't see houses. She saw stages. And the moment Dad's chair was gone, she claimed the space like it had always been hers. Mom let her. Or maybe she didn't know how to stop her. The guest list grew longer every year. Distant cousins and coworkers who thought they knew our family because they'd seen the photos online. Barbecues became performances, and I became the stagehand. Quiet, reliable, forgettable. Until this year. This year, something shifted. Maybe it was the way Samantha had Ava, her daughter, call me Miss Brittany instead of Aunt. Maybe it was the way Mom referred to the guest room as where Brittany stays, like I hadn't lived here consistently for 6 years. Or maybe it was when I overheard one of Samantha's friends saying, "I thought you said she was just crashing here." That word didn't even sting. It just echoed. It felt deliberate, like they wanted me to hear it, to wear it like a borrowed coat 2 sizes too small. That night, I sat alone in the garage, where Dad used to keep his tools, and later where I stored everything they didn't care to ask about. That was when I opened the envelope. Inside, I found copies of the mortgage payoff, receipts for repairs in my name, a notarized letter from Dad stating that the house would belong to me, signed and witnessed months before his final hospitalization. There was a scanned version of the deed transfer, not yet filed, but legally prepared. I remember holding the pages with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, not from excitement, from grief. It felt like a last conversation, one I hadn't realized I still needed. And for the first time, I understood why he had whispered those words to me. He knew no one else would protect it, not just the property, the memory, the truth. That barbecue wasn't about food. It was a funeral for the version of me they preferred, the one who stayed quiet, the one who didn't ask for credit, the one they thought they could write out of the story and call it family tradition. I didn't plan to make a scene, but silence, once weaponized, has a funny way of turning into armor. They had their stage, I had my proof, and tonight, that would be enough. The strange thing about erasure is that it rarely comes all at once. It arrives in small moments, a missed introduction, a framed photo where your face is cropped just enough, a toast where your name isn't mentioned, even though the champagne they're holding was bought with your credit card. That night, I saw it in their eyes before anyone said a word. People didn't look at me like a daughter or a sibling or even a host. They looked at me like I was someone's plus one who had shown up by accident, someone they didn't know how to politely ignore without feeling guilty. But guilt only goes so far when comfort is on the line, and everyone there had grown too comfortable pretending I didn't exist. And Samantha floated through the yard with practiced grace. She wore a coral dress that looked effortless and held her wine glass like it was part of her hand. She called people darling and laughed at stories she didn't ask to hear. When she reached the microphone near the deck, she tapped it gently and asked for everyone's attention. I was I was still at the edge of the patio, halfway through a lukewarm plate of ribs that tasted like disappointment. "Let's raise a glass," she said with a glowing smile, "to Dad, to family, and to all the strong women who keep this house running." There were claps and nods, but she didn't look at me, not once, not even by accident. Later, I stood by the makeshift photo wall she'd arranged, a string of twine between two trees, clipped with glossy prints and perfect lighting. Samantha with Dad on the beach, Samantha and Mom decorating the Christmas tree, even Ava pouting beside a birthday cake I had baked. There were no photos of me, not a single one, not even the grainy group shot from last year's barbecue where I'd spent the whole day prepping food because the caterer canceled last minute. It wasn't an oversight. It was strategy. You can't erase someone from memory all at once. But if you do it subtly, persistently, eventually, people will believe they were never part of it to begin with. That was when Marcy approached, a cousin from Mom's side, older than me by 10 years, always polite but distant. She handed me a glass of sparkling water and said, "You look well. Brittany, what have you been up to lately?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just cautious, like she wasn't sure if asking the question would open something she didn't have time to hear. I smiled and said I'd been working on a brand overhaul for a nonprofit that helps single mothers reintegrate into the workforce. She blinked, like she hadn't expected an answer. Then she nodded and said, "That sounds admirable." Then she walked away before I could ask about her son's college applications, which I knew she had posted about online last week. These moments didn't hurt anymore. They just confirmed what I already understood. This wasn't my family. This was their audience. And I wasn't a cast member. I was part of the crew, expected to set up the lights, fix the backdrop, but never take a bow. That night, though, I had brought a different kind of prop. Inside my bag, hidden behind my wallet and a folded grocery list, was the envelope, thick, slightly worn at the edges, with a gold clip holding everything in place: deed transfer, repair receipts, a notarized letter from my father, sealed in a plastic sleeve. I had carried it for months, not for revenge, not for drama, but for the moment someone pushed me just hard enough to remember. I had every right to stand my ground. As the sun dipped lower and the patio lights flickered on, I made my way back inside to refill my glass. The hallway still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something warm, like dust trapped in sunlight. Paused near the living room where Dad's old recliner used to sit, replaced now by a sleek white armchair Samantha had ordered online. It looked beautiful. It looked hollow. I sat briefly on the stairs near the entryway, the same spot I had once curled into at 12 years old, eavesdropping on a conversation between my parents about whether I should be sent to live with my aunt after a fight at school. I remember Mom saying, "She's just too intense sometimes. Maybe distance would help." Dad had said nothing, just tapped the table and walked outside. I stayed home. No one brought it up again, until now, when the silence felt exactly the same. I walked back outside and saw Ava running barefoot in the yard. her laughter unfiltered, pure. For a moment, I remembered what it felt like to believe you were safe just because the porch lights were on. But safety, like love, is only real when it includes you in the daylight. And tonight, that illusion had cracked. I wasn't here to ask for space. I was here to reclaim it, not with shouting, not with rage. There was a moment just after sunset when everything seemed too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe you, but warns you. I was, to, I was standing by the drink station, swirling ice in a plastic cup, watching the adults move through the yard like they were still in control of the story. Samantha was near the citronella candles, posing beside a distant cousin who had driven in from Phoenix. Her voice carried easily, even over the music, because she had mastered the tone people paid attention to. Light, slightly condescending, polished like glass. She didn't see me watching her, or maybe she did and simply didn't care. That's when I heard it. One of her co-workers, a man with too much cologne and not enough tact, leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for me to catch. Wait, she still lives here? His laugh was short and sharp, followed by another voice I didn't recognize saying, I thought she was just crashing until she got back on her feet. I didn't react, not visibly. But inside, something settled. Not anger, not shame, just confirmation. I stepped away from the drink table and made my way to the garage, careful not to draw attention. The door creaked the same way it always had. Dad never fixed it, said it was the one sound that reminded him to slow down. Inside, the smell of old tools and oil hit me immediately, grounding me more than anything that evening. In the corner, beneath a stack of boxes labeled holiday stuff, I had hidden a folder inside an old drawer. No one ever went through this space anymore. Samantha had tried once, got her dress caught on a nail, and never came back. I pulled out the folder and opened it slowly. Each paper had its own weight. Copies of checks I had written for roofing repairs, pest control invoices, tax documents listing me as the payer of record, and at the very bottom, a notarized letter from Dad. The ink had faded slightly, but his signature remained strong. I ran my fingers across it like a prayer, not to seek permission, but to remember why I had kept all of it. Back outside, the music had shifted to something slower, something nostalgic. Someone had lit sparklers for the kids, and I watched Ava trace loops in the air with glowing yellow light. Her innocence made the rest of it harder to stomach, because I knew someday someone would try to rewrite this night in her memory. They'd say it was a celebration, that it was perfect, that family came together with warmth and laughter. But truth doesn't hide in decorations or curated moments. It lives in the cracks, in what isn't said, in what gets left out of the scrapbook. And I wasn't going to be erased again, not this time. As I returned to the edge of the yard, I saw Uncle Richie near the grill, talking to a few older cousins. He caught my eye, gave a small nod, and kept talking. He had always been more observant than the others. At Dad's funeral, he was the only one who asked me if I had eaten, the only one who walked up to me during the silent reading of the will and whispered, "If you ever need help, you call me. Your dad trusted you." I had never called, but I remembered it. And now I was beginning to see who remembered what and who preferred to forget. Samantha returned to the microphone again, champagne flute in hand, her smile wider this time. "I just want to thank everyone who came tonight," she began, "for showing up and reminding us what this house really stands for. Family, strength, loyalty." She glanced toward Mom, who beamed. Then she said it. "And for those of us who had to carry the load when others couldn't, I see you." A few heads turned my way, but only briefly. The dig was subtle, but I had spent years decoding her language. What she meant was clear. She still believed I was a burden, that staying behind to take care of Dad and the house was not sacrifice, but failure, that her distance had been a necessity, not abandonment. I didn't look at her. I didn't roll my eyes or interrupt. Instead, I took a deep breath and reached for my tote bag. My fingers wrapped around the edge of the envelope like it was muscle memory. And just like that, my role began to shift. I was no longer background. I was no longer waiting to be acknowledged. I had brought the receipts, literally. And if they wanted to keep performing, they were going to have to do it in front of a truth they could no longer edit. When people say, the truth always finds a way out, they rarely talk about how quiet that moment can be. It doesn't always come with shouting or broken glass. Sometimes it begins with a glance that lingers too long, or a question asked too softly. After Samantha's speech ended, the applause was thin. Maybe it was the humidity. Maybe it was something else. I stood near the patio table, pretending to straighten the plastic cutlery, but really, I was watching. The edges of the night had begun to shift. Conversations were quieter. A few eyes flicked toward me, then away. Uncle Richie approached slowly. He held a paper plate in one hand and a beer in the other, but he didn't seem interested in either. "You all right, Britt?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. I nodded. He paused, then leaned in and said, "Your father once told me this place wouldn't make it without you." He wasn't wrong. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because hearing someone remember it out loud nearly broke the surface. He gave my shoulder a firm squeeze and walked off without waiting for a reply. That was the first crack. A few minutes later, I caught Marcy near the cooler. She wasn't talking. She was looking at the envelope now sitting at the corner of the buffet table, its edges weighted down by a stack of unused napkins. She didn't ask what it was, but she didn't have to. Her eyes moved from the envelope to my face and back again. I could see her putting it together. She was in real estate. She knew how property worked. She knew what that kind of folder usually contained. And I could tell by the way her expression shifted hesitation, then realization, then discomfort that she had just realized something important. Not about me, about the version of me she had believed in. Samantha was still working the crowd, laughing too loud, smiling too wide. She stood by the fire pit now, telling a story to Mom and two neighbors about how hard it had been to manage the house after Dad passed. I watched Mom nod and offer her usual tight-lipped smile, the kind that said, "I'm too tired to correct anything." The neighbors looked interested, but not impressed. And then, like a badly cued line in a play, someone asked, "So who actually owns the house now?" I wasn't close enough to hear Samantha's answer, but I saw her hand gesture vaguely toward the porch, then brush the question away with a laugh. That's when Dolores, a longtime neighbor who had known Dad since the '80s, turned to me and said, "I thought you stayed behind to take care of everything." Her tone wasn't judgmental. It was puzzled, like something didn't line up, and I took a breath and said, "I did." Then I pointed to the folder. "The paperwork is right there if anyone's confused." She didn't move toward it, but she looked like she wanted to. Her eyebrows tightened. Then she nodded slowly, like a clock resetting. I could almost hear the click, and the air grew heavier after that. The smell of barbecue, once warm and familiar, now seemed too thick, almost like it was masking something. People began shifting where they stood, subconsciously moving away from Samantha and toward the edge of the yard, where I had become a quiet center of gravity. She noticed. Of course she did. Samantha had always been a performer, and no performer misses the moment when the spotlight starts to drift. She made her way over to me with a glass of wine in hand, and that rehearsed look of innocent charm on her face. "Brittany," she said sweetly, "I hope you're not planning to make tonight about you." Her voice was low, controlled, sharp around the edges. I didn't look up right away. When I did, I said, "You made it about me the moment you tried to pretend I was just passing through." That stopped her. Not for long, but enough to feel the tension rise. "You always twist things," she said, barely hiding her irritation now. "This night is for Dad." I nodded slowly and replied, "Exactly." Behind her, I noticed Marcy again, this time standing with another cousin, both of them glancing at the folder. One of them had a phone out. I somewhere didn't need to know what they were saying. I had already done my part. The truth had been placed gently in the center of the party, like a lit candle in a room full of old newspaper. All it needed was one careless comment, one gust of ego, and everything would ignite. By the time the cake was brought out, something in the atmosphere had shifted for good. People were still smiling, still clapping, still saying the right things at the right times. But the energy had changed. It was no longer about celebration. It was about containment. I could see it in Samantha's eyes as she lit the candles. Her hands just a little too steady, her grin a little too fixed. She had started the night in control. Now, she was holding on by habit. When she passed out slices, she skipped over me once, then doubled back like it was an accident. I didn't mention it. I didn't need to. The omission said enough. Mom sat on one of the white plastic chairs near the corner of the yard, chatting with a neighbor who'd arrived late. I didn't mean to overhear, but some sentences carry weight even when whispered. Technically, the house is in Brittany's name, she said, her tone light but measured. But Sam likes to run things. You know how older siblings are. The neighbor laughed, polite and clueless. But I watched Samantha stiffen nearby, like she'd been slapped without warning. She turned so quickly it was almost unnatural, and slid into the conversation with a loud, forced laugh. "Oh, you know, Mom," she said. "She always mixes things up. What she meant is, I manage the house. Brittany just stays here." That was it. That was the careless gust of ego, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of something heavy and new. Awareness. I didn't step forward. Not yet. I let that moment breathe. Let it sink into the wood of the porch and the folds of every lawn chair. People started turning their heads, not dramatically, but noticeably. A cousin looked up from his drink. Another raised an eyebrow. A guest I didn't recognize leaned toward her partner and whispered something behind her palm. I knew what was happening. It was the same thing I'd done 100 times at branding pitches. The narrative was shifting. The audience was recalibrating. I walked over to the drink table, calmly, deliberately, and picked up the envelope. Marcy was nearby, and her eyes locked onto it as if it had magnetic pull. I handed it to her without saying a word. She looked surprised, but didn't resist. She opened it carefully, pulling out the documents one by one. Her eyes skimmed the headers, the signatures, the seals. Her mouth tightened. Then she looked up and asked softly, "Is this what I think it is?" I nodded. She didn't say anything else, just placed the papers gently on the table, spread out like cards in a game no one else realized had started. Across the yard, Samantha saw it. She excused herself from her conversation and made a beeline toward us. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice too loud for the moment. "Why are you passing around documents at a family gathering?" Marcy stepped aside. "I didn't. You said I just stay here," I replied, quiet but firm. "This proves otherwise." Samantha reached for the papers, but Marcy blocked her hand. "Don't," she said. Her voice wasn't loud either, but it carried, "People deserve to see this." More heads turned. Mom looked up. Confusion painted across her face. A few guests had started to drift closer, not aggressively, just curiously, like they sensed something was about to break open and didn't want to miss it. Samantha folded her arms and laughed in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "So what? You kept some receipts. You think that makes you a martyr?" I shook my head slowly. "I think it makes me the legal owner. I paid the taxes. I handled the renovations. I stayed when no one else did, and Dad signed it over before he passed him." The word owner seemed to hit her like cold water. Her smile faltered. "That's not true." She snapped. "Dad would never do that." I reached into my bag again and pulled out the notarized letter, still in its protective sleeve. I didn't hand it to her. I handed it to Mom. Her fingers trembled as she took it. She read it slowly, her lips moving along with the lines, her shoulders sinking with each sentence. When she finished, she looked up at Samantha, then at me. Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I met her eyes and said, "Because you wouldn't have believed me." Samantha turned away and muttered something under her breath, but the damage was done. The night no longer belonged to her. The narrative had cracked. And once it cracked, it couldn't be patched with cake or charm, not when the truth was laid out in plain sight for everyone to see. Samantha tried to laugh it off at first. She stood there near the drink table, arms folded, expression tight, voice sharp with sarcasm. "So this is your big moment," she said, staring not at me, but at the documents now spread across the table, like puzzle pieces no one could ignore. "You're really doing this now, in front of everyone." I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang in the air, let her fill the silence with her own discomfort. A few guests had gathered behind us now, pretending to look at the dessert table, but clearly listening. I glanced toward the photo wall, where just hours ago she had curated a version of this family that excluded me completely. I looked back at her and said, calmly, "I'm not doing anything. I'm just not hiding anymore." That was the moment the unraveling began. Not explosive, just quiet, like a thread being pulled that no one had noticed was loose. Samantha reached for the documents again, this time more aggressively, but Marcy was faster. She picked up the notarized letter and stepped backward. "I've seen enough," she said, her voice low but clear. "These are real. This isn't a stunt." Samantha's face flushed. Her voice rose. "You think you're some kind of expert? This is a family matter. You don't even live here." Marcy's response was calm. "That's exactly why I can see it for what it is." The noise around us dimmed. Conversation stalled. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stay or slip away quietly. Someone dropped a fork. Someone else whispered, "Is that the actual deed?" And another voice, hesitant, asked, "Did she really pay the taxes I didn't have to say yes?" The paperwork did the talking. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was undeniable. The kind of silence that settles only when the weight of truth becomes too heavy to ignore. Then Samantha turned on me fully. "You're bitter," she snapped. "You've always wanted to make me look bad. You're just mad because I made something of myself." Her words weren't even aimed at me anymore. She was performing again, this time for damage control. But the audience had changed. I looked around and saw it in their faces. The uncertainty, the recalibration, the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, the version they had believed was never the full story. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations. I simply stepped forward, took the envelope from the table, and held it out for everyone to see. This house was signed over to me legally before Dad passed. I stayed. I paid. I protected what he built. I didn't need to explain what she had done. I didn't need to say that while I cleaned mold from the basement. She flew to Miami for influencer retreats. That while I signed contractor checks, she was negotiating brand deals. It was all written in the contrast. I was never meant to be seen, just relied on. Samantha's voice cracked. "You're tearing this family apart. Is that what you want? To humiliate me?" I looked at her, not with anger, but clarity. "No, I just don't want to be erased." Her mouth opened like she had more to say, but nothing came out. Behind her, I saw Mom watching, her face pale and unreadable. She didn't stand up. She didn't defend either of us. She just sat there, one hand gripping the armrest, as if holding on to whatever version of peace she had convinced herself was worth preserving. And then, quietly, someone clapped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even certain, but it broke the tension like a match to dry grass. Another guest nodded slowly. A cousin walked toward me, picked up a copy of the inspection records, and said, "You did all this?" I nodded. She looked at Samantha, then back at me. I never knew. I gave a half smile. No one asked. Samantha didn't yell again. She just stood there, the weight of years of performance starting to press down all at once. I didn't feel victorious. I felt still. For the first time in years, I wasn't playing defense. I wasn't waiting to be invited into a room I had already kept clean. The house hadn't changed. The lawn was still patchy. The lemonade was still too sweet. But I had changed. And now, the story was changing too. I don't know when exactly the party stopped being a party. It might have been when the second cousin from Riverside put down his drink and stared at the envelope without blinking. It might have been when Mom folded the letter from Dad back into its sleeve with hands that had stopped trembling, not because she was calm, but because she'd stopped denying what she already knew. Or maybe it was the moment I took a breath, stepped forward in front of everyone, and said, "You all deserve to know who's actually been keeping this house standing." I wasn't emotional. I wasn't angry. I wasn't performing. I just laid out the documents on the buffet table in full view, one by one. Property tax receipts, deed transfer dated and notarized, contractor quotes and payments I had made from my own account, photos of the roof before and after I paid to replace it, the invoice for the HVAC system that broke the summer Dad passed, the insurance policy I updated, the utility bills that never once saw Samantha's name. I didn't explain them. I didn't need to. They explained themselves. And when I reached the final page, I said what needed to be said. This home legally belongs to me. It has for over 2 years. Dad gave it to me while he was still able. I didn't ask for it. I didn't expect it, but I honored it every day since. The silence that followed didn't feel heavy this time. It felt earned. Even the kids had gone quiet. Ava stood a few feet away, one hand curled around her sparkler, no longer waving it. She was watching Samantha now, her mother, who stood frozen with her mouth slightly open, eyes darting around like she couldn't find where the script had gone. She had always known how to control a room, but tonight the room no longer responded. Someone coughed. A glass clinked somewhere near the patio. I waited. I wasn't rushing this moment. I had waited years to be seen, and now they were all looking at me, not with confusion, not even with pity, with realization. Samantha stepped forward, her voice breaking the stillness like a snapped wire. "You ambushed us," she said. "You ambushed your family at a dinner meant to honor our father." I turned to her slowly and answered with the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be loud to be final. "No, I protected what he left behind when no one else would." She laughed bitterly, looking around for support. "You've always been dramatic. Brittany, always made yourself the victim." I nodded once. If telling the truth makes me dramatic, then maybe it's time someone else tried it. And then Leo spoke. He had been silent the entire night, standing near the grill, eyes following every word, every page, every shift in tone. But now, his voice cut through the tension like it had been waiting for permission to speak. I remember Dad telling me. He said, "Britt's the only one who ever showed up. This place wouldn't survive without her." Samantha spun toward him. He was confused when he said that. She hissed. He was sick. Leo didn't flinch. He said it before he was sick. And after, every time I called, he turned to the crowd and added, "You all know she stayed. You all knew. You just chose not to look too closely." From somewhere behind the deck chairs, I heard someone say, "Well, it's clear now. I didn't turn to see who it was. I didn't need to. The tide had shifted, not with yelling, not with spectacle, but with quiet facts that could no longer be talked around." Samantha stared at the papers on the table, then at me, her voice softer now. "You think you've won, but you've destroyed this family in the process." I stepped closer, not threatening, just firm. "You destroyed it the moment you turned Dad's legacy into a set piece for your Instagram." I just refused to keep cleaning up after the performance. No one defended her this time, not even Mom, who was now sitting silently, her fingers pressed together, her eyes closed as if waiting for the night to pass like a bad storm. But this wasn't weather, it was accountability, and it wasn't going to move until it had settled into every corner it had once been shut out of. For the first time in a long time, I felt grounded, not triumphant, just solid, like I finally had a place to stand that wasn't borrowed or tolerated or halfway erased. I I didn't look for applause. I didn't want it. The truth had been spoken. The records were public. The roles had reversed. And Samantha wasn't the one holding the script anymore. After the documents were read and the silence had settled, people began to drift toward the doorways like they were waking up from a long, shared hallucination. No one rushed. No one spoke loudly. They just started collecting their plates and folding napkins, trying to make themselves smaller, as if that would excuse the years they spent watching from the sidelines. I stood by the edge of the patio, feeling the gravel under my shoes, noticing how much clearer the night air had become. Samantha hadn't moved. She was still beside the drink table, one hand clenched around the base of her wine glass, the other twitching like it wasn't sure whether to throw something or reach for someone. She finally broke the silence with a sound that didn't know what it wanted to be. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. "You think you've won?" she asked, her voice tight, eyes still scanning the guests for allies who weren't there anymore. "You've embarrassed me. You've torn down this family in front of everyone we know. You've humiliated our parents." I turned toward her slowly, choosing each word carefully. "No, you did that when you erased me from every story, every photo, every plan. I just finally stopped letting you do it, though." She took a step closer, her tone rising, no longer rehearsed. "You've always needed attention. You've always hated me." I shook my head, calm and steady. "I didn't hate you. I just stopped forgiving you." A hush fell again, not because of the volume of our voices, but because people were finally listening without distraction. That kind of silence feels rare, earned, and dangerous to anyone used to filling it with noise. Mom stood up then, slowly, almost reluctantly, and for a second, I thought she was going to defend Samantha again. But she didn't say a word. She walked over to the table, placed her hand on the deed, and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me, her eyes clouded with something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or understanding, or both. She nodded once, just once, but it was the first gesture in years that felt like acknowledgement, not approval, just recognition that I existed in the full truth of everything I had done, and that was enough. Samantha wasn't ready to let go. She never had been. She pointed at me with a trembling hand. "If you think I'm just going to walk away from this, you're delusional. This was my home too. I don't care what paper you brought. This house is ours." Her voice cracked at the end, not from weakness, but from panic. I stepped closer, not to intimidate her, but to make it clear there was no room for misunderstanding. "You have 72 hours to collect your things. After that, the locks change." She blinked, stunned. "You wouldn't." I looked at her, quiet and certain. "I would, and I will. The documents are filed. The decision isn't emotional. It's legal." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. And that was when I realized the most surprising part of all. I didn't need to fight anymore. I didn't even need to defend myself. I had outgrown the version of me that begged for space in a room I built. Guests began to leave. Some walked up and thanked me quietly. One woman, a friend of Samantha's from work, apologized without saying what for. I just nodded. Let them sort out their own guilt. I wasn't carrying it for them anymore. Ava hugged me tightly on her way out. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. I smiled at her and replied, "For the first time, I think I am." She nodded like she understood more than a child her age should, then skipped off toward her dad's cars. Inside the house, I could still smell the lemon cleaner from earlier that morning. The living room had that half-lit glow. It always did when only one lamp was on. And for the first time, it didn't feel like I was standing inside a memory. It felt like I was exactly where I belonged. I placed the envelope in the locked drawer of Dad's old desk, then sat in his chair. It creaked the way I remembered. Reliable, honest, like a voice that never needed to raise itself to be heard. Outside, I could hear Samantha arguing with someone. Maybe Leo, maybe herself. It didn't matter anymore. The house wasn't hers to argue over. It wasn't a backdrop for her curated story. It was history, real, documented, protected, and I had reclaimed every square inch of it with truth, not revenge. By the next morning, most of the folding chairs were still out in the yard, tilted slightly in the grass like they were exhausted from carrying too many unspoken truths. Plates were left stacked near the trash bin, a few half-full cups still lined up along the porch railing. Stood at the back door in my sweatshirt and old slippers, holding a mug of coffee I hadn't taken a sip from. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was quiet, and after years of being talked over, quiet was enough. Samantha hadn't said a word since she stormed off with her phone in one hand and her heels in the other. Her car was still in the driveway when I went to bed, but by sunrise, it was gone. No note, no apology, just absence. I didn't feel triumphant. There wasn't some dramatic final scene where she begged for forgiveness or admitted everything. She just left, and the truth she couldn't control stayed behind without asking permission. Leo texted me around 10. No big speech, just a message that said, "I should have asked more questions. I'm sorry." I stared at the screen for a minute, then replied, "Thank you." There was nothing else to add. He wasn't my enemy. He was just silent too long. And silence, when stretched over years, becomes its own kind of betrayal. But unlike Samantha, he seemed ready to own his part in it. That meant something. Mom didn't call. I wasn't surprised. She had always preferred discomfort to confrontation. She'd rather smooth the edges than acknowledge the cut. Still, part of me wondered if she would reach out eventually, maybe with a grocery store bouquet or a voicemail that mentioned everything except what actually happened. I wouldn't chase it. Some things only have weight if they're offered freely. And this time, I wasn't carrying anything that wasn't mine. Around noon, I started cleaning, not because I felt obligated, but because the house deserved it. I picked up the napkins, threw away the wilted centerpieces, rinsed the serving trays. When I got to the porch, I paused. The plaque I had custom made months ago sat still in the drawer where I had hidden it. Simple, brass, etched with one line, Brittany Furlan, legal owner since 2021. I screwed it into the wood near the front step. Not for show, not for revenge, just for truth, the kind you don't need to raise your voice to prove. That afternoon, I opened the windows in every room, let the breeze move through the hallways like it had its own memory. I stood in the center of the living room, where the light cut diagonally across the floorboards, and I breathed, really breathed, not the shallow kind you take when people expect you to disappear between conversations. A full, rooted inhale. It smelled like old paint, faint lemon cleaner, and something I hadn't recognized in a long time, belonging. Later that evening, I found the photo Dad kept in the back of his desk drawer. It was of the house in the early 90s, when the lawn was still patchy and the tree in the front yard hadn't yet curled toward the fence. I was in the photo, barely 7, wearing overalls too big for me and grinning with a popsicle stain on my chin. Samantha was beside me, arms crossed, clearly annoyed about something. Dad stood behind us, hands on both our shoulders. There was something unpolished about the picture. No filters, no posing, just presence. I framed it, placed it on the mantel next to the letter he'd written me, a quiet kind of monument, not to loss, but to what stayed and what mattered. That night, I made tea and walked barefoot onto the porch. The yard was clean again, though a few candle jars still lined the patio, like forgotten witnesses. A neighbor I barely knew passed by with her dog, paused, and said, "He'd be proud of you." I didn't ask how she knew what happened. Word has a way of spreading when it's finally worth listening to. I nodded, thanked her, and watched her disappear into the dusk. I didn't reclaim this house for applause. I didn't do it for vindication or to win some invisible score. I did it because it was right. Because sometimes the quietest people are the ones holding the weight no one else wants to see. And because truth, once spoken clearly, doesn't need to shout to be remembered. Have you ever felt invisible in a space you helped build? Ever watched someone rewrite your story while you stood in the room? What did you do when it was finally your turn to speak? Let me know in the comments. Your voice matters too.